Yes, welcome again to another episode of the Washington SXM podcast. Like, share, comment, and subscribe as always. And also, don't forget to click the notification bell so when I drop a video, you can realize and check it out. Anyway, don't know. I was talking to a friend of mine and in a conversation, some friends, a group of us, and this conversation came about Alexander Hamilton, he's from Nevis, from the Caribbean, but he's one of the founding fathers in the US in the Constitution, and he was the first Secretary of State. So I went and did some research on him, and I said, let me just do a video on it one time and wrap it up with about the founding fathers of the Constitution, and also specifically George Washington. Let's get into it.
Washington slaves were expected to work 6 days a week, with most slaves having Sunday off. On top of their chores on the plantation, they also had to manage their living quarters, grow and cook their own food, and repair their clothes. Many enslaved people also produced goods they could sell for money.
Grow your own food, repair your own clothes.
Basically, self-sufficient. Slave named Easter, selling a broom for 6 pence.
6 days a week for work.
Some
Like,
slaves played games.
most people have 6 days a week.
In 1798, a witness described a group of 30 slaves playing a game called Prisoner's Base, which involved running and jumping. But there really wasn't that much time for games. At Mount Vernon, Washington expected his slaves to perform their labors whenever it was light out. In a 1789 letter to one of his overseers, he wrote, "To request that my people may be at their work as soon as it is light. Work till it is
As
dark,
soon as the day
and be
break."
diligent while they are
nice.
at it can hardly be necessary, because the propriety of it must strike every manager who attends to my interest." Washington added, "Lost labor can never be regained." Because of that,
You hear that?
he ordered the overseer to ensure that every laborer,
He's the first
male or
president of the
female,
United
does as
States.
much in the 24 hours as their strength, without endangering their health, or constitution will allow. While Washington and his family lived together in their mansion, their slaves weren't so lucky. Mount Vernon was an 8,000-acre plantation, divided into 5 different farms. Mansion House Farm, closest to the Washington family's house, was home to the most slaves, around 90 people. They included bricklayers, carpenters, cooks, gardeners,
Basically,
and millers, who all
tradesmen.
helped the plantation run smoothly. The farm also housed Washington's wagon and cart drivers, butlers and maids, and others who worked in the mansion. Another 45 slaves lived at Doe Run, and 57 lived at River. 41 slaves lived at Muddy Hole, and 76 at Union. The outer farms mainly grew crops, and the slaves living there were forced to work in the fields all day.
A
These
couple of
living
hundred
arrangements
slaves
were
right
used
there.
to separate members of enslaved families, so they rarely saw each other. For example, one enslaved man at Mount Vernon, called Joe, lived at Mansion House Farm, while his wife, Priscilla, was a field worker and lived at one of the
So they
outlying farms,
deliberately
known as
separate
Doe
husband
Run,
and wife.
with a couple of 6 children. Joe was only allowed
Yeah,
to
they
visit
got
his
6
family
kids.
on days off, which were pretty much exclusively Sundays and holidays. Even then, visiting the family wasn't easy for a slave. Sometimes they had to walk
I could
miles
imagine.
after sunset to see their loved ones. Joe and Priscilla, for example, lived 3 full miles apart and had to walk home before sunrise the next day.
Most people don't want to walk
Washington, of all people, had
a
complaints
meter,
about the
100 meter must have
situation
3
he himself
miles
had engineered.
right now.
He complained that his slaves were tired because of their night walking to see their families.
That's obvious. Of course, I'm gonna be tired. Hell, I expect walking all
Enslaved
night.
people at Mount Vernon lived in tight quarters. In 1798, a Polish poet named Julian Nimcewicz visited the plantation and recoiled at what he found in the slaves' quarters, which he called huts. In his own words, their habitations cannot be called houses. They are far more miserable than the poorest of the cottages of our peasants.
That's mean.
The husband and his wife
George
sleep
Washington was
on
a
miserable
mean
bed,
slave owner.
the children on the floor. In one home,
didn't care about
the
their
visitor
health.
witnessed a boy about 15
At all.
lying on the floor with an attack of dreadful convulsions. The living conditions, coupled with poor nutrition, meant slaves were often stuck with infectious diseases. On January 22nd, 1792, the farm manager reported, "A great many children are very bad with the whooping cough at every quarter." Sometimes Washington's request went far beyond what most slave owners asked from their slaves. According to his
Pause. Say here then. George Washington was more brutal on slaves than all the other slave owners in the entire in Mount Vernon area. The entire area, he was the most brutal slave owner. So he wasn't just only people hail him as the first president and one of the founding fathers of the US, but this guy did some dark things to people, to slaves. So yeah, look at this continue.
historian Robert Darnton, who wrote a book called George Washington's False Teeth, The most famous founding father bought teeth from his slaves, and some evidence supports the idea. In 1784, the Mount Vernon Plantation book recorded the transaction where Washington's dentist, Dr. Jean Le Meilleur, purchased 9 teeth from a slave.
So
At the
it's
time,
human teeth.
dentists bought teeth to transplant into patients' mouths.
Well, then,
but
yeah,
in a
and then they'll have
move
the
that will
ivory
maybe
to
surprise no
make
one,
dentures.
the slave owner paid his slave only a
Still
third
you.
of the commonly accepted rate. In 1784, Washington wrote, "I confess I have been staggered in my belief in the efficacy of transplantation." Several years later, he lost his last tooth and moved to full dentures. Washington's famous dentures also contained human teeth,
Naturally.
possibly teeth he had also bought from his slaves for bargain basement rates.
Naturally. You're lucky you didn't steal them.
Dozens of enslaved people tried to flee from Mount Vernon, but only some were successful.
Yeah,
During
with
the
that
American
brutality,
Revolution, when
he was
Washington was
on
busy with the British,
conditions,
a group of
obviously.
17 slaves crossed enemy lines to escape. The 14 men and 3 women successfully fled to a British warship docked in the Potomac River, offshore from Mount Vernon. Slaves who
Pause, yeah, because that time, in the 1700s, the British Empire was already against slavery. So there was, if you could reach to the British ship in any area, if as long as the army is there, you basically become free. At that time, the British Empire was wailing against slave owners. Then they were destroying ships and hanging slave owners. But Washington was a president, so they can't even mess with him like that because. And you see, fun fact, I didn't know this. All them teeth, human teeth. He's slave. He bought his slaves' teeth. If they're saying bad, but I think he does take them because they belongs to him. Why would he pay them? He's already working them and not paying them. So why would he pay them for teeth? Makes no sense. But anyway, let's continue. I think that's that they forged that part to benefit him.
closely served, the Washington family also attempted to escape. Washington's assistant, Christopher Shields, unsuccessfully tried to flee with his fiancée. Hercules, the family cook, escaped from the plantation,
So
as did Martha Washington's
a
maid,
lot of people tried to
Mona
run away
Judge.
from the slaves.
Judge
from
was
the,
22 years old
from
when
Mount
she
Vernon.
learned her owners planned to gift her to a stranger as a wedding present. She fled to New Hampshire, where she lived the rest of her life as a free woman.
That's a free
In
woman. That's good for her.
1792, Washington marveled at how well his slaves trained their dogs. He wrote to his manager, "It is astonishing to see the command under which their dogs are." But he was also suspicious. Washington suspected the slaves were using the dogs to steal sheep at night, which they then sold on the black market to make
That's-
extra money.
So the
Getting
slave
some of
was-
that side of
people
the
was useful
ACCA
even
or
then.
any pet person, Washington ordered his manager to round up the dogs and kill them. If
Damn.
slaves were caught with unauthorized pets, they were punished on Washington's orders. It's worth mentioning
Woman
Washington
actually
was the
killed
only
dogs.
founding
You
father
hear
who
that?
hanged
Killed
dogs. Thomas
dogs.
Jefferson also hanged his slave dogs as a punishment. Have they never heard of John Wick? In a practice that sounds like something Montgomery Burns would do, George Washington kept a record of when his slaves gave birth, because their children automatically became his property, and he
Yeah,
needed to
naturally.
track his wealth.
AKA
In one report
breeding
dated
farms.
February 16, 1793, an overseer noted that during the previous week, the plantation gained 9 lambs and 1 male child of Linus. After giving birth, enslaved women at Mount Vernon were expected to return to their regular jobs in 3 to 5 weeks, leaving their newborn in the care of other children or elderly relatives. Women on such maternity leave were still expected to work from home and took part in sewing and knitting
So at
soon
no
after giving
point
birth.
they get a break.
Slave children received no formal education and were expected to work on the plant.
Pause. So at no point when a woman is pregnant, she get a break. Even while she's pregnant, she have to work. And after she give birth, while home, she still have to work. Well, not less work, but not physical work, but sewing, not picking cotton in the field. But and 3 to 5 weeks, they have to leave the kid with someone else. So that means there's no breastfeeding all day. So they out in the field while the kid is home at that young age. And but anyway, back then they used to take care of each other. They used to look out for each other back then too. So, but this guy was a brutal. But not only George Washington, because not to mention James Garden was one of the fun. 7 of them. There's Anton Alexander Hamilton. He's from the Caribbean. He's from Nevis, as I said earlier. And but his father is Scottish, I think, and his mother is half British. So that means he's most likely leaning more. He could pass as a white man, basically, because of who he's playing. But even though he was born in the Caribbean. I did some research on him. He didn't really own slaves, but he married into a family. I think his wife's name was Elizabeth. And they own slave. That means he benefits from that. And in them times, slavery was normal. So I don't see him. Hercules! I don't see him going against the grain because he was the first treasury of he was the first treasurer of the United States. Secretary of Treasury. So he was a brilliant guy, even though he was mixed and an immigrant. But because of his career, and he also in my research it came up he also sold slaves. But again, he sold them for his in-laws. He didn't own them personally. He just did he's like the middleman basically. So yeah, so James Adams is the only other one who never owned any slave. Him and his son. They didn't have any slave. Which one of them? You have who again? You have James Madison and John Adams. They all owned slave. Every single one of those forefathers except John Adams and Anthony Alexander Hamilton and someone else. They never had it. I don't know which one. So when they wrote the Constitution, they didn't see black people as people. So that means that the people all the while the Constitution of the United States have nothing to do with black people. It didn't design it. It wasn't written for them at no shape. No way, shape, or form, because all of the founding fathers was slave owners, and most like one or two of them out of all of them didn't have any slaves. So yeah, let's continue.
As soon as they were physically able. Some might think Washington was merely a product of his time, and these practices were par for the course for a slave owner. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Washington was cruel to his slaves, even by the standards of other slave owners. One of Washington's neighbors, a man called Richard Parkinson, claimed it was the sense of all Washington's neighbors that he treated his slaves with more severity than any other man. Washington is known to have whippings when slaves disobeyed. And
he's hailed one of the great founding fathers,
where they would never see their families.
Ben Franklin was also a founding father.
In 1799, when Washington died in his Mount Vernon home, his estate housed 317 slaves. Washington inherited his first slaves at age 11, when his father died and left 10 slaves to his son. Washington and his family owned more than 500 people over 5 decades.
You hear that?
He also interacted with
From
hundreds
10
more throughout his life.
to 500.
In addition to the hundreds of slaves living at Mount Vernon, there were many other slaves in Fairfax County, Virginia. By the time Washington helped win the American Revolution, more than 40% of the population in Fairfax County was made up of enslaved people. Mount Vernon slaves frequently resisted their enslavement. Some fled to permanently escape slavery, while others resisted through subtle methods, such as faking illness or working slowly.
Smart.
Some misplaced or damaged tools or equipment as a form of protest. It was difficult for masters to prove that slaves were passively resisting. Slaves also resisted by stealing from the plantation. Washington's overseers often accused the slaves of stealing tools,
most
rum,
likely
food,
can't prove
and
it.
fabric. In 1794, Washington advised a woman planning to open a shop to avoid dealing with slaves. He wrote to his manager that if she deals with them at all, she will be unable to distinguish between stolen or not stolen things. At one time, Washington lived in Philadelphia, where Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act ordered enslaved people to be set free after 6 months in the state. However, Washington used a loophole to avoid losing his own slaves. Every 6 months, he made sure his slaves left the state to ensure they could not use the law to their advantage.
You hear that?
Over time,
The good guy was
Washington's
cruel
ideas
and
on
also
slavery
brutal.
evolved. In his later
Manipulated,
years, the
manipulated
president
the
became
judicial
convinced
system,
that
the same system
slavery
he
as an
created.
institution should gradually end. When he wrote his will in 1799, Washington included orders to free his slaves after Martha Washington's death. However,
What the fuck,
because
dude?
Martha technically owned
This
the
is what I don't
majority
like.
of Vernon slaves through
Yeah,
her
you can't
first
let him
marriage,
finish this.
Washington couldn't actually free all of them. The will left Martha afraid her husband's slaves might try to kill her. Martha's friends may have considered this fear reasonable, because according to Abigail Adams, the wife of President John Adams, Martha was advised to
Why
set
the
them
hell am
all
I
free
yawning like
at the
this?
close of the year. She listened to that advice, and on January 1st, 1801, just over a year after Washington's death, Martha set her husband's slaves free.
She lucky because they kill her.
So what do you think? Is your
Let's stop there. So you see that the man, George Washington helped wrote the Constitution and signed it. So even the system he put in place, he find loopholes. Anyway, he wrote it, so naturally you're gonna find loopholes in it to manipulate and use it to his advantage. So he was cruel, brutal, manipulative, and criminal in my estimation. So don't forget. So you have Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, James Adams, James Madison. Who else? That's 5. How many? Who else? I'm trying to think. I don't remember the others on them, but for now, so they were all slave owners basically, and so that's why I say America is rooted in slavery, and that will never end. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'm gonna continue on this tune and do some more history digging, and then get back to you guys and give you something. Anyway, don't know it is. Boom bam, one love, peace. Yeah, we out.